There is a very real problem with Dragon Age the Veilguard's dialogue, but it's probably not what you think it is, because most of the game's more obvious conversational failings can actually be explained by a single fundamental flaw in the writing. Throughout the game's sweeping, perilous journey across Thedas, the Veilguard offers plenty of dramatic moments, meaningful choices, and colourful characters. While it may not be the game that every Dragon Age fan wanted, and it may not be the greatest RPG ever made, it does still have plenty of good to offer, and I have personally enjoyed my time with the game even with its faults. The underlying writing issues don't make the game bad overall, but they do significantly weaken what could otherwise be a thoroughly compelling main story. The witty dialogue isn't especially funny. Conversations will regularly breeze past important details while lingering on irrelevant topics, and characters do spend too long counseling one another through their personal problems while apparently facing a world-ending threat. But all of these issues emerge from the same place. The real problem here is that the rising conflict of the story is repeatedly and consistently sabotaged by the dialogue. Almost every time that a conversation successfully raises the tension, it will bafflingly pull back for the sake of philosophizing, a cute joke, or a moment of sensitive reflection. The Veilguard does present some meaningful drama, but it also softens the sharp edges of its characters to prevent any conflict from going too far. It gives the player the opportunity to make some bad choices, but is then immediately forgiving and sympathetic. The writing is too often guilty of turning the heat down to a simmer when it should let the player feel the burn. So how exactly does the game's dialogue sabotage its own momentum? What can we learn from focusing in on one specific pivotal scene? And what are the undesirable implications of this inconspicuous writing choice?
We don't get to wallow and whine, because no one else is taking this fight. Nice speech, Rook.
While you could easily debate the merits of each and every conversation in the Veilguard with regards to their expositional efficiency or capacity for exposing character motivations, I firmly believe that the most important thing that any dialogue should do in such a game is not draw attention to itself. Dialogue functionally succeeds so long as the player isn't constantly thinking about the writing, because they're engaged with the game instead. And this is a rule that could probably apply to any element of game design, because the majority of games want the average player to mostly be playing, not debating the fundamental qualities of its construction. They want the player to feel immersed in the world as much as possible. In Dragon Age, the Veilguard, the dialogue does, unfortunately, draw attention to itself all too often. And it does so because it consistently betrays the narrative thrust of the main quest. Throughout the story, the game regularly brings Rook's full team together to discuss what just happened and what they might do next, and it's rarely as engaging as it should be. They might have just fought a dragon, or they might be about to embark on a dangerous quest, but they almost always sound like they're just discussing dinner plans or something else trivial. One of the biggest problems with the Veilguard's story is that, at the end of most missions, it's entirely unclear what the obvious next step is for our heroes. And that means that these post-mission discussions are responsible for some serious narrative heavy lifting, and they simply aren't up to the job. Each of these roundtable chats is tasked with taking stock of the previous mission and initiating the next one. And while it feels like each of these conversations should create drama and raise the stakes while moving the narrative towards the next event in an unexpected way, what usually happens instead is that the player is subjected to shallow analytical discussions before a random character in the group eventually says, how about we do this thing next, and it just moves on from there. Most quests begin with random companion statements rather than emerging from the rising conflict in each conversation, and wherever conflict is present in the dialogue, it is usually settled by the end of the discussion. Arguments are usually used simply to bridge a gap rather than to further the story, and nobody is allowed to stay mad at one another for long. If you take the time to explore the Veilguard's world and chat with its many diverse companions, you will experience a great deal of dialogue in the game. And obviously, these exchanges need not all contribute to the escalating stakes of the main story. I would not wish to dismiss the entertainment value of incidental banter or the discussion of background details when delivered in a quiet moment, as those both absolutely have their place in an RPG this big. They are at greater risk of drawing attention to themselves though if they drag on too long or don't land well, so they're hard to get right. Either way, at the heart of the story, the best, most meaningful dialogue emerges from and builds upon rising conflict. And in fact, it is often this rising conflict which gives meaning to those rare moments of levity too. Side quests help expand and add depth to the story, but they need to feel rooted in the same world where the primary conflict is happening, and they should ideally contribute something meaningful to that world as well. The various companion missions in the Veilguard usually do successfully run concurrent to the main story, by playing with the same ingredients on a smaller scale and with a focus on a specific character. But the dialogue here usually falls at the same hurdles by pulling back from the conflict just as the friction starts to build. Whether you're dealing with a minor threat, working on a potential romance, or considering the aftermath of catastrophic events, the game never lets the conversation heat up too much. In practice, this means that every character feels like they have had their sharp edges softened. They constantly talk about their feelings, but are seemingly terrified of being truly vulnerable or having any firm opinions on things that should matter to them. Even when it's not obvious, I think it always registers on a subconscious level that your companions are afraid of real tension, because dialogue seems hollow and nobody feels things as much as they ought to. It should be okay for these characters to hate each other, but the game makes a point of forcing Rook into the therapist role to ensure that everyone is getting along. And aside from all of that feeling a bit preachy, the main reason this is actually a problem is because this kind of dialogue serves to constantly alleviate any drama which should be developed or eventually resolved within the story in a more meaningful way. That's not to say that there isn't a place for this kind of gentle dialogue in other games, but in this story, the atmosphere should be tense, and yet it's more often annoyingly comforting. The rising tension of the story is also betrayed by the occasional overabundance of snarky and sarcastic dialogue in the game. I don't think it's nearly as much of a problem here as it was in a game like Immortals of Avium, but there definitely are some conversations which bounce between cheesy quips when these characters should be taking their situation seriously. And equally, there are several occasions where the game's dialogue is diverted by socio-political issues which are entirely deserving of discussion in some form, but feel entirely irrelevant to the central conflict in this story, and end up flattening the tension when shoehorned into conversations about dragon attacks. Oftentimes, video game writing feels like it could have done with a few more drafts. When there is a lot of dialogue to be written in a game, much of it can end up feeling rushed or clunky in context. context. But conversely, the writing in The Veilguard actually feels like it might have been through too many drafts and changed too many hands, losing all of its character and its drama in the process, seemingly in aid of making it more comforting or straightforward for the player. Every conversation feels as though it's been toned down and over-polished to avoid emphasizing the drama. Each scene achieves its purpose but little more. Each character is unique, but they also lack bite. The complex lore is present, but it's not in the limelight. Rising conflict is repeatedly undercut by vapid dialogue that could belong to anyone in the room. The extent of player choice in the Veilguard's dialogue is a discussion for another time, but the key thing to mention here is that those choices don't generally have a huge impact on the shape or tone of these conversations. The suggestion that the player is forced to be good all the time might be an exaggeration, but they are definitely put into a box more than should be expected from an RPG like this, as the dialogue options often come down simply to how much or how little the player wants to comfort another character. On a macro level though, there are still some great real decisions which are posed to the player across an engaging large-scale narrative. One of these choices can be found relatively early in the game, when, after returning to the lighthouse through the crossroads, Rook is suddenly set upon by his compatriots with news that dragons are attacking both Minrathous and Treviso. Then, as former residents and firm advocates of those two cities, Nev and Lucanis will both put forward their case to suggest that you help save their people.
Treviso's a merchant city. It has no defenses, and the canals run everywhere. If we don't stop that dragon, people will die. Innocent people. My people. They either die right away from the dragon, or slowly after, from blight in the water. We need to go to Treviso.
And leave Minrathous to burn?
Nev.
The Shadow Dragons will fight, right to the end of it. But we're the only ones keeping the Venatori in check. And if we fail, the Venatori will take advantage. They'll make a push for the throne, and hand the gods the entire Tevinter Empire.
Have we been able to...
Damn it! There's no time! I need to go home. I need to be in Minrathous.
And I must go to Treviso. Go where you feel you must, Rook. We cannot wait.
What's our move, Rook?
The choice of Minrathous or Treviso, as presented in this scene, is worth analysing, chiefly because, as a critical decision point early in the game, it should represent the best, most polished writing in the story. And yet it still exemplifies the tension-crumbling issue I've discussed. There are several moments in the game with dialogue that is obviously much worse than it is here, which we could easily pick apart line by line. But I don't believe that to be especially constructive when discussing the writing problem on the whole. The reality is, in pretty much any game with this much chatting, there will be instances where the voice acting is a bit off and the writing is crude and awkward. But this sequence is basically as good as it gets in the Veilguard. And in essence, this dialogue does succeed at divulging the necessary information required to move the narrative forward and for Rook to make an informed decision by the end. It's a simple but effective setup for a moral dilemma, and the probable outcomes should be pretty clear to the player. Whichever city you don't head toward will likely suffer extensive damage as a result of the dragon attack which you weren't there to help stop. Arguably, the most important consequence of this decision is also obvious. You are going to upset either Nev or Lucanis, and for the majority of players, I would wager this decision is as simple as asking themselves which character they prefer and or wish to romance at some point. Because, based on your choice, one of these companions will actually become more difficult or even impossible to romance. All that said, I don't think it would be fair to argue that this scene entirely fails, and I also think that these stakes are reasonably big and meaningful. But as is the case throughout the story, the rising conflict is undermined by limp dialogue that shies away from the drama, even if it is grammatically correct and largely coherent. Lucanus tells the player why they should go help his city, and the tension rises. Then Nev cuts in to say, "What about Minrathous?" And just when you'd expect these two divided priorities to come into conflict, Lucanus softly, sympathetically says,
Nev,
and pulls the drama back from the brink of disagreement. Then Nev tells you what's at stake in her city, and the tension rises slightly again, before Rook gets a dialogue choice which will always be quickly interrupted by Nev, who declares the discussion is over and heads for Minrathous. And then comes the final betrayal of this rising conflict when Lucanus says,
go where you feel you must, Rook.
And he leaves too, before Harding is left to pose the question of which dragon you want to fight. After everything I've already discussed, it is probably obvious how this scene sabotages its own building friction, even with such massive narrative stakes. Lucanus's moment of sympathy for Nev is a classic example of the many tension-undoing moments present in the game. It's such a simple, inoffensive line, but it subtly undermines the conviction in his previous declarations just enough to send the rising conflict plunging momentarily downward. Far worse than that, though, is the way the pair both run off shortly after, allowing Rook to make a decision without either one present. For a start, their departure suggests immediately that both possess a level of independence and competency that means they don't need Rook's help to save their city. Then, Lucanus's "go where you feel you must" comment relieves much of the pressure from the situation, because he's saying he'd like your help, but he doesn't want you to feel forced into anything you're not comfortable with. And finally, both of these characters being gone when you make the actual choice means that the people who are affected most by the decision aren't present to react positively or negatively to your judgment. In summary, then, while the decision still feels meaningful, the writing here does everything in its power to reduce the tension and take pressure off the player. With a choice like this, there is, in a sense, no right answer. Either decision means one character and one city will suffer, and the outcome will be legitimately obvious in the game's world. But the way that this scene progresses, the game actually makes it seem less meaningful than it really is, by sabotaging the story's momentum. And this is just one example of how this problem harms the storytelling throughout the game. It seems like almost every conversation resolves itself with a sentiment that equates either to, well, we can only go and try our best, or, well, we did the best we could. In the case of this scene, as you're given a choice between two dragons, you're told to do whatever you think is best, when you should be left with opposing forces telling you whatever choice you've made is unequivocally wrong or right. And even though, as I've said, the results of this choice are meaningful in-game, those results will also be tempered by gently falling tension too. Obviously, whichever character you don't go to the aid of will be upset, but they're just ridiculously understanding and accepting too. The writing here seems utterly afraid of creating drama even when the systems and branching paths are set up to effectively allow just that. The dialogue repeatedly does an excellent job of making big decisions seem trivial, and serious outcomes appear, at most, slightly bothersome.
You did your best. Both of you.
We all did. Just means our best must be better.
It will be. Next time, we'll be ready.
Count on it.
In the end, I think it's a shame that Dragon Age the Veilguard seems so afraid of creating too much drama and making the player feel something meaningful. Because what value does a critical story decision really offer if it doesn't leave the player questioning their choice? Why bother with an in-game romance if the companions are prevented from ever becoming three-dimensional characters? What is the point of a perilous journey if every threat you face is weakened by the power of group counseling sessions? The Veilguard repeatedly tells the player that they shouldn't feel bad about their mistakes, and in a way, I do think that that's a perfectly lovely sentiment to offer. There is a weirdly therapeutic quality to a lot of the game's writing which some might find comforting, but it doesn't feel in any way appropriate for a game about fighting dragons and monsters and elven gods in order to save the world. In the face of rising tension, the dialogue should have worked to enhance and further the drama, instead of repeatedly attempting to stifle it. All that said, I don't think the game's failings are enough to prevent a great many players from having a lot of fun with it, and these issues certainly haven't ruined the game for me. As ever, I can only suggest seeking to enjoy the game first, rather than fixating too much on what doesn't work, because there is plenty to enjoy in this world. But ultimately, I know this game could have been a whole lot greater if it hadn't shied away so often from the story's rising conflict. But how do you feel about Dragon Age the Veilguard's dialogue and the story in general? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more video games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.